Professor Graham. Professor Suzanne Graham is the subject leader of the Secondary Modern Languages Initial Teacher Education Programme at the University of Reading. She researches learner strategies and their relationship with proficiency and self-efficacy. She researches motivation for language learning, creativity and language learning, and reading and listening comprehension in a second language. She is a really passionate supporter of what goes on in schools, and in my view is a massive ally to our cause as language teachers. And I'm so grateful for her being here today. Suzanne, if I may, I'm going to make you a co-host, and this will enable you, I hope, to share your materials.
Okay, let's have a go. All right, so hopefully you can you see that? Yeah, okay. So thank you very much, Ollie, for the introduction. You've set the scene really nicely. I think I shall be preaching to the converted a little bit, but I'd like to offer a little more evidence, insights into really the topics that are in my title here: self-efficacy, teacher agency, and the new GCSE. But really, I think, you know, the essence of what I'm going to be saying is in the subtitle, the importance of balance. And, you know, I think when I was planning this talk, what really sprang to mind was this image that I'd already used in a resource that I created around a really lovely poem in German by Adel Karasholi, which has been adapted by someone else, which I'll come back to a bit later on, in a very different way from the way that I used it. So this poem, Seiltanz, is about a poet from Syria who lives and writes in German, and he talks about the balancing act between the two identities he has. But what really interests me in the title is that in German we talk about tightrope dancing, Seiltanz, to dance on a wire, but in German we talk about tightrope walking. And to me that kind of crystallizes two different ways of approaching a difficult situation. So we can either walk quite gingerly along this wire to our goal, perhaps not feeling very confident, not really enjoying it very much, or we can do the same thing with a spring in our steps and dance to the other side with more confidence. So I'd like to suggest that actually the new GCSE, it is possible to be dancing on that tightrope rather than just walking on it in a rather scared and timid way. I also considered the subtitle of Keeping Sight of the Big Picture, but my colleagues from Oxford, you can see here, beat me to that subtitle in an article that they wrote for the special edition of the Language Learning Journal that Ollie referred to. And that article talks about the Ofsted Curriculum Research Review, which very much aligns with the new GCSE, and in particular in the way that it aligns with the focus on vocabulary, phonics, and grammar that I've called VPG here for short. So these authors point out that it is dangerous, potentially dangerous in our teaching if we focus too heavily on three individual building blocks in the early stages of language learning. Firstly, because the claims that we should be doing that aren't particularly supported by evidence as presented by Ofsted, but perhaps more centrally, because apart from vocabulary, phonics, and grammar, there are other pillars which I think are also very important to support the edifice of language proficiency, including strategic competence and intercultural understanding, which I'll talk a little bit more about. But I think most centrally is that they make the point that actually in teaching and in dealing with the new GCSE, it is teachers' professional judgment in determining the most appropriate instructional approaches for a given class on a given occasion that are really important. And that's something I will also echo. So Ollie's saved me a bit of time talking about the new GCSE, which is good because I've probably got far too much to say. So we have this knowledge curriculum very much focused on vocabulary, grammar and phonics, very limited range of vocabulary. And the material that will be used in the GCSE examination will come very largely from the most frequent 2,000 words in a language, which means there will be very little expectation that learners will need to work out the meaning of unknown words. Now, of course, that's good on the one hand. We don't want learners to be overly challenged by words that they've never met before. We see kind of the opposite, I guess, in the current GCSE, in a way that we have too many things that learners can't possibly know. But the new GCSE, really in terms of having a very minimal emphasis on being able to infer meaning, I feel poses dangers in terms of how we are preparing learners for language learning. In the response to the consultation, there was a slight softening about what learners might have to infer. And they said, rather begrudgingly, I think, that there would be some inferencing required, but really learners would have to do that based on grammatical or linguistic knowledge. They should be able to work out the meaning if they know their grammar and vocabulary. And as you said, limited number of words to be known, reading aloud and dictation. Culture mentioned in the aims for the GCSE, but notably absent from the subject content. So all those things are echoed in the Ofsted Curriculum Research Review, which I'm going to talk a little bit about, because I think it's kind of fundamental to understanding the perspective that is driving the GCSE and which we need to bear in mind. So the review, again, talks about these three pillars of vocabulary and phonics and emphasizes that when we are teaching, we should be primarily selecting material to support our school's systematic sequencing of vocabulary and grammar, rather than choosing something because it's culturally rich or interesting. And similarly, that you teachers need to ensure that pupils are not exposed to large amounts of unfamiliar language too early, as that could demotivate. All this, the GCSE and the Ofsted review, were very much lauded in a DFE press release for the new GCSE, where it was claimed that much more limited content, clearly defined content, and building on the building blocks of language learning will help students build confidence. That was the claim. And confidence also goes by the name of self-efficacy. It's a term that's sprinkled liberally through the Ofsted Curriculum Research Review, and which I happen to have done quite a lot of research on. So I really wanted to look closely at this and was prompted to write an article about what self-efficacy is, but more importantly, what it isn't, and really to try to tease apart the view of confidence and how we boost self-efficacy that is propounded in the GCSE and in the Ofsted Curriculum Review. So, as many of you will know, I'm sure, self-efficacy originates in the work of Bandura, a psychologist, and it's very much about our belief to organise and execute the courses of action required to produce given attainments. So it's about being successful, yes, but also about having agency, to understand that what we achieve is down to our own actions. So it's not about having an easier exam, it's about actually what do we achieve as learners or individuals. And critically, self-efficacy is about the extent to which learners and individuals believe they can persist within challenging situations. That's one point, in pursuit of a valued goal. So challenge and value in bold there for a particular reason, because we do not develop resilient self-efficacy by being given more defined and easier tasks. We actually need to learn how to deal with challenges if we are to develop resilient self-efficacy and if we are going to persevere. Self-efficacy is also important in a theory of motivation called the expectancy value view of motivation. And that's kind of like an equation. So it argues that motivation depends on two things: expectancy, expecting to be successful, but also critically valuing whatever it is we're trying to attain. So value in this model includes intrinsic interest, enjoyment, also perceiving that the activity will help you attain a goal that is important to you as an individual. Now, we can see this equation as either an addition, a plus sum, or a multiplication. So is it motivation equals expectancy plus value, or is it motivation equals expectancy multiplied by value? So if we think it's the first one, hopefully you can see my little sum there. So 10 units of expecting success, 0 value for the activity that we're doing might still lead to reasonably high motivation of 10. And to me, I think that's what the GCSE and the Ofsted review believe. However, research and theory is adamant that expectancy value is actually a multiplication. And as if we're any good at maths, we know anything multiplied by 0 equals 0. So if we're really confident that we can be successful because we know what we're going to be tested on, but we really don't value the task that we're going to be given, then our motivation will be 0. So that's really important to bear in mind about, the whole idea of a clearly defined, supposedly easier GCSE, which is, debatable anyway. Okay, let's carry on a little bit, talking about what Ofsted and the writers of the new GCSE think promotes self-efficacy. So the Ofsted review says that self-efficacy is promoted when learners have language learning experiences that they perceive as successful, by which I think they mean in which they are successful. They also say it comes from knowing how to sound out words in a foreign language, so phonics, and they reference that with an article from 2011. Interestingly, the next one, they say that self-efficacy comes from ensuring that the building blocks of language, vocabulary, phonics, and grammar are in place. No reference to support that at all. And then the last one, seeing your classmates communicating effectively. So what is not said is just as important, I would say. So if we take those two points that Ofsted says leads to self-efficacy, experiencing success, seeing others experiencing success. When I looked at those two articles closely, I saw that indeed they did say that. However, both critically report on learners having learning experiences and curricula that are very, very different from the vocabulary, phonics, and grammar limited curriculum recommended in the Ofsted review and hence in the GCSE. And in both studies, learners' self-efficacy grew because learners were successful in activities that those students valued. So in Leeming, activities that develop their oral communicative competence rather than their grammatical accuracy, and in Mills through creative interaction with cultural artifacts and collaborative group work. Those crucially, I think, are also things that learners in England value. And so my research with primary learners suggests that. Interestingly, also a study by Taylor and Marsden, 2012, talks about learners wanting more group work, communicative activity, rather than more practice and explanations in Year 9. Also, what is not said in terms of vocabulary, in terms of phonics. So this study that says self-efficacy comes from knowing how to sound out words in a foreign language, actually, that study didn't set out to show and doesn't show that explicit phonics instruction leads to improved self-efficacy. The authors really only looked at the relationship between being able to sound out words and feeling positive about French and wanting to continue with it. And in fact, being good at phonics wasn't really very important for feeling positive about learning French. And so really, there is pretty limited evidence in support of the Ofsted Curriculum Research Review and the new GCSE. That is not to say that vocabulary, phonics and grammar are unimportant. However, there are other pillars that are important, and we can include vocabulary, phonics and grammar alongside other things that matter. And I'm going to talk about that a bit more. So the first thing I'm going to talk about is a study, French language education, unlocking read and FLIR, which in many ways is also feeds into the new GCSE, but in a way that I probably wouldn't agree with, which was a very large randomized control trial I worked on with Robert Waugh, where we tested learners before, immediately after, and sometime after an intervention with Year 7 learners, 900 of them from 36 schools across the country. We delivered an intervention over a number of weeks. We worked with the class teachers who actually did the teaching. And critically, we worked with challenging reading texts that were culturally rich, chosen to be of interest and to give insights into French culture. So we had 3 groups of students. The first students just read the challenging text. They weren't taught how to access them. The second group that I was in charge of, we taught them how to infer meaning from these challenging texts. And the third group, which Robert was in charge of, they were just taught phonics. We assessed what impact all this had on their vocabulary, their phonics, and also their self-efficacy and confidence and their reading comprehension. So we taught phonics, or Robert got the teachers to talk phonics very systematically using schemes like you can see on this slide, where each couple of weeks, learners were taught explicitly French phonemes in a way that it very much accords with what's expected for the new GCSE and the Ofsted Research Review. And they had material like this. Importantly, they then practiced reading aloud with real texts. So here you can see the first text that we gave them. Interestingly, if you analyze that text, only 77% of the words come from the top 2,000 in French. So it wouldn't make its way onto a GCSE exam paper, but we used it with Year 7 and they coped just fine with it. They also enjoyed reading it. In my intervention, we used the same text. This time, we taught them 8 ways to work out words that are unknown. So for example, looking at words surrounding the problem word, keeping going, evaluating whether the meaning that we think comes out of that makes sense. Teachers modeled that, learners practiced, and we taught a range of strategies. So not just using grammar or linguistic knowledge. Learners reflected on what they'd learned, and it was very much about developing learners' self-regulation. What did we find? Importantly, we found that, well, so as we might expect, the phonics group got better at reading aloud, not really surprising. But all 3 groups made pretty similar progress on reading aloud. So neither intervention improved learners' ability to understand French. Vocabulary, yes, the phonics group made the most progress, but the strategies group also learned a lot of vocabulary. So vocabulary growth doesn't just come from learning phonics. And perhaps most interestingly, self-efficacy, confidence for reading challenging text. Most progress was made by those who were taught the comprehension strategies, and that was particularly the case for lower attaining learners. And so individual differences matter in the sense that different types of instruction work in different ways for different learners. We also found that actually learners' self-efficacy for reading was not at all influenced by their level of phonics or vocabulary knowledge. So completely contradicts what is in the Ofsted Research Review and what underpins the GCSE. Okay, moving on quickly, looking at the time, I need to speed up a bit. So just moving on to another project, Creative Multilingualism, where we looked at the relationship between creativity and language learning, whether creative approaches to teaching can actually enhance language learning and whether learning a language can stimulate creativity. This time we worked with Year 9 learners of French and German. We examined whether an intervention would improve reading, writing, vocabulary, and general creativity through using different types of texts. So we had one group of teachers who used factual texts, and we had another group of teachers who used poems. Both were on themes that are quite difficult, perhaps, love, death, migration, and otherness. And teachers used both kinds of text in two very different ways. So the first kind of way we called functional, which is another way of saying phonics, vocabulary, and grammar. And the second way we call creative. So in the creative approach, the activities were very much about involving the learner on a personal level, focusing on the emotional content of the text, looking at metaphors, whereas the functional approach was about getting information, thinking about grammatical accuracy, phonics accuracy. So for example, it's a set of activities that we used around a poem, beginning with finding out about the poet. So in the creative approach, it was all about what did the poet feel or believe when they wrote the poem. In the factual, functional approach, it was about what are the facts. In the activities, for example, translation, the creative approach involved learners translating from the point of view of being nearest to the meaning, the expression of meaning, whereas the functional approach was about accurate translation. And then in terms of grammar, while the functional approach focused on grammatical explanations, in the creative approach, we asked teachers and learners to look at how grammar is used to express meaning and emotion. And we had similar things for reading aloud. So when we read aloud, how do we express emotion through intonation? What did we find? So not an awful lot for the German group, unfortunately. For the French group, we found that learners learned a lot of vocabulary, but especially in the creative approach and for using the poems. In reading, for French, the creative approach led to greater increases in reported confidence, and in general creativity, for both languages, there were gains for the literary using the poems, and that was particularly the case for literary creative teaching. So lots of evidence really that creative teaching rather than phonics, grammar, and vocabulary can lead to linguistic gains. We also found similar things for writing, where interestingly, learners who got better, who made progress in a creative approach, did less well in the functional approach, and actually what they liked. So the French learners much preferred the creative approach. The German learners much preferred the functional approach. So that really reinforces again that in teaching and in learning, individual differences and finding the right balance matter. That takes us back to teachers. So how confident and you feel as a teacher, whether you feel you have self-efficacy and agency, that you believe in what you're doing, matters for how well learners do. So you as a teacher being confident and feeling you have agency increases learners' attainment and well-being. Self-efficacy and agency for teachers is really linked to teachers' values and believing that you are teaching in a way that is in concordance with your own values. So really, I think when we're thinking about how we teach, we have to think about what it is that we're trying to achieve. Yes, we are trying to achieve good examination outcomes, but I'd argue we're probably also trying to achieve something else in our learners, a love of languages and becoming a language learner. And really research cannot tell us how to do that. It can tell us, it can give us pedagogical proposals, provisional specifications, not recipes. So I think, you know, we have in the new GCSE a danger of conflicting priorities, and we know that things don't go well if what teachers are asked to do conflicts with what they believe in. We also know that MFL teachers, like learners, think that the purpose of learning and teaching a language is to develop learners' intercultural understanding and their ability to communicate. So that's what teachers believe is their purpose. Now, while that aligns with the stated aims of the proposed GCSE, it doesn't align with the proposed changes to content. So we have problems in terms of teacher morale as well as alienating learners. So what's the solution? I think we have to bear in mind that other approaches are possible and that there are different research principles. Okay, so the principles that you follow need to align with your own values as a teacher and your own learners' values, and that educational research is contestable. So there are different ways to get to the end goal. There are different principles. So here are principles from me. The first link, I have principles around oral communication. Yes, phonics instruction and grammar as being important, but there to support communication and in combination with teaching learners how to infer meaning. Similarly, Rod Ellis, a respected linguist, a very balanced set of principles where meaning and a focus on grammar are equally important. So balance and other ways of teaching are possible to achieve that goal. And really, I think we need to be very wary of perspectives that view language learning in terms of either building blocks or culture. We need to find a middle ground where we are having the building blocks, but also culture. And therefore, we are dancing on a tightrope, doing what we believe in, being confident and not walking along it. And, you know, quote from a teacher we work with, she found that actually working with year 7 and challenging text was perfectly possible. They can learn something and they can enjoy it. So just very briefly to finish, I hope, back to my tightrope. So when I created the original version of this resource, I focused on vocabulary, phonics and grammar to a certain extent, but I also had a focus on meaning, the culture that was embodied in that, metaphor and empathy, and thinking about how we can value difference and otherness. And it tried to bring out that image of dancing. The version that's been created by another organization is quite different, actually, much longer. And really the emphasis is just on vocabulary and phonics. And I can't really see the cultural, metaphorical or empathy related aspects that were originally in there. And I think it's the poorer for that. So yes, we can and probably should have dictation and reading aloud to prepare learners for the GCSE, but we can also focus on expression and intonation and meaning. Same with translation, same with grammar. Grammar is there to express meaning, and I think we need to emphasize that in our teaching as much as correctness. When it comes to inferring meaning, I really don't believe that anyone works out the meaning of an unknown word just through their linguistic knowledge. I can't see how that's possible. We always use a number of different strategies if we're good learners. And I think as teachers, we need to teach learners that. And so I think it's really important to keep sight of that bigger picture so that we don't think of research and curriculum and practice as this linear relationship. We put in something at the beginning and it comes out at the end. We are in danger of having curriculum that is really restricted and leading to conflicting priorities with a threat to teacher self-efficacy. So I would argue that we need to find the right balance, keeping sight of that bigger picture so that we can dance rather than walk. Okay, I have some examples, but I haven't got time. So I've put some links there that will lead you to more examples of some of the things that I've done. And I hope that was of interest.